Hi, yeah, thank you for coming in, everybody. I'm going to speak in rapid fire Yorkshire, and then we're going to switch over to a North American accent. So I hope you're all going to keep up. I've got a copy of the book. With me, just in case you wanted to know what it is that what we're looking into, and it's definitely readable in a reasonable amount of time. Don't worry, it's not going to come through the door or anything. Get through that. So what it falls to me to kind of introduce this, and one of the things I wanted to do is just tell you kind of why I was motivated to get involved in a book project. And one of the reasons why I came into academia was I finished my first degree. I went into a couple of jobs and I ended up working in a big unitary authority, unitary local government. So for anyone outside of England, the kind of municipal scale. I enjoyed that job, but it was about 2007, 2008 when there was a lot of development of onshore wind farms. So I'm an environmentalist, really. I'm a bit of a greenie. And that meant that I was into the onshore wind movement. I really wanted to see it thrive. And there was big subsidies from government at that time to drive the industry forward. And my idea was, look, the council owned land, it's got access to finance. There's no reason we couldn't set something up and enter that market. I had the numbers all worked out, but no matter what evidence I put down in front of decision makers at the council, you know, this would make money, it's in line with our climate change goals, I kept hitting a brick wall. And then one day a councillor said to me, sort of looked at the figures again and said, this can't be true. Just kind of had to bite down because it was a councillor, but said, if this was true, then the private sector would be doing it. And there was a little light bulb moment that went on and said, it doesn't matter what I say or evidence that's put in front of this person or this kind of person. It's not going to get through something which I now call ideology, which I didn't have the language to explain at the time. And in my academic career, I've gone to the bottom of like, where does that ideology come from and why is it important in decision making? But it really wasn't until I met Alex and Matt that I was able to talk about it in a bigger kind of politics of material stuff, the politics of the provision of electricity, the politics of the provision of water and healthcare. You know, these things really matter. And I didn't know whether to introduce this second example because it's a bit sort of feelings a bit mundane. But the other thing that used to frustrate me in that role was waste collection, bins. Everybody who's on the call today will have participated in what we call a spatial contract around waste, around keeping cities sanitary today. It will have happened today. You've used your bins. I had to put my bin out this morning. And that's the bit of the system we see, the tiny little bit of the system we see. But that little bit of the system that creates our kind of freedom to just chuck something in a bin, it is connected to a much broader system that involves taxation, it involves politics, it involves what we do with our landscape, whether we landfill, recycle, incinerate, and it matters to other systems like the food system as to whether we compost, and what we do with that should be at the centre of our politics because it's about our resource use. And it kind of is and it kind of isn't. It's kind of part of politics, but we don't really have a language to talk about it. We don't really have a way of framing and analysing what these politics of material systems are. And that's what I got out of writing this book. And I couldn't have done it without Alex and Matt, because whilst I have a systems and a sustainability and a political economy perspective, Matt was the one that really took us to task on what do you mean by freedom? What do you mean by rights? What do you mean by politics? And Alex really took me to task on, but you know, what do you mean by exploitation? What do you mean by sustainability? What do we collectively mean when we talk about rights? And I would have given a tooth for this book when I was working in local government, because it explains like some of the frustrations I was having. So if anything at all, anybody who's going to go and work in cities or be a part of sustainability in human settlements, like I would have enjoyed reading this when I was in that role, and I enjoyed writing it as well. So I'm going to hand over to Matt in a minute, but that's really what I want people to get out of this is just a new tool in the toolbox to work on sustainability in human settlements. And as I pass over to Matt, I say is the hardcore philosopher that really took us to task on what do we mean by rights and freedom he introduced us to ideas like reliance systems and agential capacities. And I would try and use the terms interchangeably. Like, no, don't, you're not allowed. And I think that really improved what we were doing. So I'd just like to hand over to Matt to take us through and share some of our thinking on that area.
I think it's actually Alex who's gonna.
Yeah, it's okay, Stephen. It's 6 in the morning here in California, so I feel very groggy, and so I don't mind being skipped over. But I'm gonna just I just want to say thank you to everybody at MUP for having us and for having faith in this book. It's really amazing to be here. I'm sorry that you can't see me. I'm not sure what's going on technologically, but I look like rubbish at this hour of the day anyway. So you're not really missing anything. Yeah. So thanks to Tom Dark in particular, to Alice, to late Mick Moran, to Julie Froud, for Carol Williams, for all the folks who had faith in this strange little book. And thanks to all of you for joining. We wanted to give you a little sense of some of the origin story of the book, because I think it'll maybe help make sense of what this book is really trying to do and where it's coming from. So I arrived in Leeds in 2013 and met both Matt and Stephen separately pretty early on in my time at Leeds. And we had, at the time, very different conversations. So, Matt, I'm an urban planner and an urban geographer. Stephen is an energy geographer, and Matt is a legal and political philosopher. So Matt and I started talking, and I've been working on an idea around kind of a new social contract. And you'll read in the book, and there's a lot of you folks going around have been thinking about kind of new social contract work. And I knew that I'd come out of sort of the right to the city space, the right to the city idea, and I'd come out of a lot of work on rights and justice, and those ideas were really, really important. But I knew that there was something kind of missing. There was something in this new social contract stuff, something about informal sets of agreements. But I'm not a philosopher. I didn't really feel like that comfortable digging too deeply into it. But I knew that there was something about a new social contract around urban systems, urban stuff, something to do with cities, something to do with housing. I'm a houser. That's my main area. And Matt and I started talking, and what Matt works on an idea about reliance, about the way in which we rely on certain material things, like actual objects and systems that produce them, in order to be able to be free, to be able to do things, to be able to act. Matt's a philosopher of agency. And so that was essentially one set of questions, right? How do we think about what is a new social contract around these kind of core systems that give us the ability to act? And so Matt and I started talking and started trying to bang ideas out. And at the same time, Stephen and I had met, and we were having a lot of conversations about systems. And Stephen introduced me to the idea of systems of provision, sort of ways of thinking about systems in kind of more vertical ways, right? From sort of soup to nuts, how they all come together. We started banging around an idea of what we called foundational urban systems. Not exactly the sexiest name. There's actually a working paper you could probably still find on the Foundational Economy website. And one of the big things and big frustrations for Stephen and I is that we were either folks in the systems world were like, oh, it's all connected, man. It's all like part of the system, which is extremely unspecific and not necessarily all that helpful. Or we would be in a more political economy space where people are like, oh yeah, the collective or the state, or everybody had these kind of fixed ideas of what a good politics looked like that had no like real basis in the actual system. And Stephen's an energy guy and I'm a housing guy, and you couldn't find two more different systems in terms of like the actual material world, the culture of it. If you touch a house, it's not going to kill you, whereas if you touch a transformer, it's going to kill you, right? Just they're so different. And so our joke, being that this was Yorkshire in 2014, was about the difference between the production of housing and the production of beer, because that felt like a really easy way to understand that these two things are both really important, but really, really different. And how do we create a set of politics that recognizes the difference between different systems? So somehow, basically what was started as two separate conversations, we quickly realized, hey, the three of us need to figure out a way to talk. And this again is then where the larger community came in, where we're really grateful. Matt was able to raise a little bit of money for a seminar series. We were able to bring in a lot of folks. We were able to start to engage with the foundational economists a lot more. And through that sort of collaboration, not just the three of us, but through collaborating and talking and banging ideas out around the rest of the community it leads, we were able to kind of put together this book that, again, does, I think, really it does a bunch of stuff, but the two most important things in some ways is it tries to articulate this idea of what a new social contract of these kind of core systems we depend on, what we call the spatial contract. How do we understand it? And a lot of what it is based on is really understanding these systems on their own terms. And that means not just the systems themselves, but the cultural spaces that they operate in. So again, we now, if there's anything that we now understand over the events of the last 6 months, is that healthcare and policing are both very different systems, not just between each other, but depending on the cultures and societies and points in history in which they exist. And that's in some ways the spatial contract in a nutshell.
Okay, so I'm Matthew Smith, and I'm going to say a little bit about some of the philosophical foundations of this, but I also want to thank all the staff and the editors at MUP and Manchester University Press for supporting us through this process. And I should actually probably thank, I don't teach at University of Leeds anymore, but it was an amazing community. And as Alex indicated, we received an enormous amount of institutional and financial support from them, and that allowed us to push forward. And of course, I should really thank my co-authors, who together we have very, very different points of view about these things. And there's a kind of way in which the process of us coming to a settlement, an agreement about how to produce this book is almost in great simplicity and miniature of some of the things that we were thinking about. And so now I'm going to give a little bit of an abstract characterization of it, but I do want it to touch on some of the, I want to bring it so that it touches a little bit on the language that we're getting in, we're getting today. And we didn't think of the book as prescient or anything like that, but we built the book around a concept of freedom. And the concept of freedom is something that is being deployed in mass politics today like never before in many ways. So when we usually think about the notion of freedom, we think about it in terms of a kind of absence of domination or an absence of something getting in our way. Thus, when people talk about wanting to be free not to wear masks or free to go outside or so on and so forth, they're talking about something preventing them from doing something, right? And when people talk about a kind of a notion of being liberated from state oppression, what we're thinking about is the bodies of police officers going away. And these are all extremely important notions of freedom. They're essential, and we cannot understand the politics without them. But what I wanted to bring to the discussion was a notion of freedom, not as absence, but freedom as presence. And I think that the reason why we care about freedom is because we care about being able to live our lives in a certain way. We care about being able to imagine for ourselves and collectively how we want to live, and then have that realized in the world. Not freedom as absence, but freedom as presence. Freedom as the things in the world that make it such that we can live, not the things in the world that need to go away. But how do we think about that? You know, that's actually, it's not a small matter, right? And it was through conversations with Alex and Stephen, and I have to say it's one of the most generative intellectual experiences of my life to interact with these people who have totally different backgrounds from me, intellectually, etc. And one of the things that I came to realize was that when we think about freedom as presence, what we need to think about is we need to think about the systems that constitute our abilities to do things. And I'll just give you a very, very simple example that we use repeatedly throughout the book, and that's transit. So if I want to be able to move somewhere, if I want to be able to go somewhere, typically we think, well, you put me in chains and you tie me down, I can't go somewhere. You have to free me from the chains. But the thing is if there aren't roads or if there aren't transportation systems, then I can't go anywhere anyway, right? So, or in order for me to go somewhere, it's going to be much, much more difficult. There's great limitations on what I can do. So these things need to be built and they need to be maintained, right? I call the systems that allow us to act, and I don't want to say allow us, because that word allow in itself invites a kind of presence absence. It obscures the presence part and highlights the absence part. So I say the things, the systems that realize our abilities, that constitute our capacities. I call them reliance systems. And so the roads that we walk on and the crews that build those roads, the systems that prepare the ingredients for the asphalt and transport them and put them on the roads, or if you're in a park, the crews that blaze the trails and maintain the trails and so on and so forth. And this is just, these are minor cases. These are the systems that allow us, and I can't keep using the word allow, that realize our abilities to act. And this is in many ways at the heart of my contribution to the book, is for us to begin to see our freedom as capacities to do things, and then to see those capacities to do things as systems of production and reproduction that are centered typically around material objects, not always, but typically. And so the idea then is that we have to have a politics that is centered around the production and reproduction of these reliance systems. And a politics that's centered around the production and the reproduction of these reliance systems has to be highly sensitive to the cultural, geographic, et cetera, specificity of the production and reproduction of these systems. What it takes to produce housing and heat and so on and so forth in Northern England is very different than what it takes to do that in New England, where I am in right now, in Boston. And it's very different from what it takes to do in San Francisco, which is where Alex is right now. And then now we're talking about the global north here. Now we just simply have to shift our attention to other kinds of geographic spaces, and we're going to get an entirely different set of conditions for the production and reproduction of these systems. And any politics, we argued, any politics that doesn't take into consideration the specificity of these systems won't be able to develop a kind of acceptable contract, a healthy spatial contract that will then allow people to collectively produce and reproduce these systems. So in other words, in a nutshell, and I'll end here, in a nutshell, the book is about what it takes to produce and reproduce human freedom. If we understand human freedom in terms of reliance systems, which have a certain material and cultural specificity. So that's the kind of ground floor philosophical contribution I made to the book. And now I'll hand it over to Stephen, I think, who's next on our list. I think it's Stephen, who's going to talk a little bit about escaping certain ideological traps and how we think about the systems and their reproduction.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I will echo the thanks for the rest of the Manchester team that brought this all together, and sort of build on this idea of reliance systems. So I spent a long time, Matt spent a long time sort of sending me stuff or thinking through this idea of reliance systems. And then we developed these ideas that there's a spatial contract that covers these reliance systems that sometimes is an obvious contract, like your electricity contract, right? That is a formal agreement that you enter into, but there's a bunch of other agreements and a bunch of other kind of more informal ways of working with the electricity system that's not covered by that contract. So I don't think it's just like one piece of paper. But I will use the electricity system to illustrate what I'm going to say next because it's my expertise. But this can apply to housing and waste and water and all these kind of things, all these reliance systems. And we don't draw a boundary in the book about what counts as a reliance system. We leave that to other people analysing this idea. But what I want to first of all say is that most of these systems are large technical systems. So they are a thing, you can touch them. It's even the legal system has courthouses and jails and things like that, places where juries have to sit. And then you're producing and reproducing. So these material systems, you have to kind of contend with them. And one of the best illustrations of the idea is a long-term collaborator in another part of my work who I would speak to about the electricity system, who would say, well, it all just needs nationalising. And I would say, well, why? Well, the state needs to own it. But why? Like, I'm not against that idea at all. Like, I think it's a reasonable response to some of the problems that we face, but the state needs to own it is not a reasonable response to the problems we face if they don't say why, because that's a politics-centered appreciation of systems, where if you can say if you can narrate what I'm going to do next and then come to the conclusion that a change of ownership structure is needed, then that's a reasonable solution. So just imagine most Western power systems, not North America, by the way. North America is a complete basket case in terms of the political power systems, but certainly across Europe. We had a lot of centralized power systems that were largely owned by the state and developed and built out by the state pre and post Second World War. And then about 1980, this little idea called neoliberalism started to creep in, that markets and private ownership was better for delivering efficiencies in big systems like this. So the British, first out, well, we did some experiments in Chile that didn't go particularly well, and the ramifications of that are still happening. But we privatized our electricity system and made a market out of it. Now, you do not need to go into the intricacies of electricity markets, particularly in this webinar, but think of it like a market. You have buyers and you have sellers, and your prices meet in the middle. And that drives down costs for consumers. And that's fine if you had like 40 or 50 buyers and 40 or 50 sellers, because you had 40 or 50 power stations and a few utilities. And that kind of made sense, and the utilities would send on the electricity to people. And then all of a sudden, people started screwing solar panels to the houses, and then that's a problem. And then people start building bigger renewables. So they start building wind turbines on land and in the sea. They start utilizing tidal or whatever it is that doesn't conform to the way we think about the market working. So we build this big market of private buyers and sellers in such a way that they've got a sort of a fuel price, a labor price, and all this kind of thing, and they're big and they can bear the transaction costs. And by that, I just mean the admin of participating in the electricity market. And then you get 4 million homes with solar panels on the top, and you get massive wind farms out in the North Sea to try and deal with climate change. And incrementally, you change this market to deal with them, because they don't cost anything to produce. They cost a lot to buy and put in the sea, but when the wind's blowing, the electricity is free, so you've just got to recoup your initial investment. And all of these things just start to destabilize all of the kind of market making, all of the institutions of ownership, all of the institutions of finance, all because we start to make what we might think of as a political decision to put a solar panel on our roof because I want to be part of the green transition. You know, it's not a vote, but it's still a political act. And then that system starts to destabilize. And when it does, that spatial contract has to change. It's the institutions governing it, even the wires that are outside of your house and the transformers down the bottom of the street that are used to dealing with power going one way now have to deal with it going the other way. So things fundamentally have to change, but they don't have to change just because of politics. They don't have to change just because we like the state or we think that a big utility owned by a foreign investment fund doesn't have our best interests at heart. No, it's about, you know, that can still be your politics, but if you can understand the actual system that you're intervening in, then you're going to make a much more sophisticated, probably powerful intervention. And our kind of contribution here is naming that as an intervention in the spatial contract. And within the book, we enter into some discussion about, like, why do people make the argument that private markets are better in this space? Why do people make the argument that commons is better or state provision? And where does that come from? And when should you call that out? And when can you intervene in that? So it does mean that we had to escape some of our kind of easy political armchairs and say, well, you know, would there ever be a space, like big discussions, would there ever be a space for private provision of prisons, for example? And then it's a big discussion about whether that should be, whether that is ever morally part of a healthy spatial contract. And if you go into depth in the book, you'll see the principles that we set out for a healthy spatial contract. But then we have to think about where do these things go and how do they intersect with people's lived experience of them, which is about geography and exploitation. And that's what I'm going to hand over to Alex to expand a little bit on also, if the tech's still working, Alex.
I think I'm still here, so as long as folks can still hear me. Yeah, thanks. I mean, so there, you know, just to reiterate, you know, there's you know, again, the key starting point for us in many ways is that if you want to talk about freedom, freedom has to be made. To be free from things is not good enough. I mean, you know, to be free from oppression will not put food in your belly. It will not put a roof over your head. It will not build the roads. It will not build energy systems. Those actually all have to be made. And then if you want to understand them, and again, despite like there's been so much ideology attached to these systems, but what we're asking people to do is, as scary as it is to put the ideology down, even if it's a good kind of progressive ideology that we would all maybe all of us on the call would support, you got to start with the system itself. And that there are times where for the specific system, the specific place, that it may go counter to what your initial instincts are because of the needs of the specific system. Again, we suggest different principles and kind of moral positions in chapter 1 on how to understand that. In chapter 2, we kind of break down a lot of different ways that we build up these system ideologies and how we understand them, both from kind of systems thinking and also from neoclassical economics. We do some repurposing of neoclassical economics in different ways. In the 3rd chapter, we talk a lot about how another way of understanding these systems. Again, we're trying to get folks to really try to take a step back and figure out ways to really understand the systems that we all rely on and how we think about them. So chapter 3 really comes out of my work in urban studies. So it's trying to understand how systems are really attached to human settlements, right? That a lot of, if we look around us, the places in which we live are really in some ways, one can think of them as a set of system, an amalgamation of different systems built at different times, kind of layered on each other, old systems, new systems, these kinds of things. But the real question, again, is that, again, it's going to make some people, I think, uncomfortable. Again, for folks, if you're coming, especially from a traditional kind of Marxist or socialist political economy, you might feel that the book is a little bit of a challenge, and that's kind of good. We're like, we love, fellow travelers, we love you, but this might, the goal is to get a little uncomfortable here. Things aren't really working, and I think historically, any of the big kind of top-down ideologies, I don't think have necessarily worked. But it doesn't mean that it's a book that doesn't have, I think, a strong moral backbone and isn't truly kind of a progressive book. I think some will accuse us of being kind of neoliberals, but it's simply just not true. Just got to read a little bit deeper. And one of the ways that we really root it, and I don't know, I hope again that we make a useful contribution that is especially useful in the current moment, is the way that we try to, the book, chapter 4, the final sort of substantive chapter of the book, really looks at the ways in which these systems are at the center of exploitation and oppression throughout the world. And to do so, we adapt Iris Marion Young, one of my favorite, or one of all of our sort of favorite thinkers, 5 Faces of Oppression. Again, so Iris Marion Young in the 1990s writes about sort of the way of a kind of update of how she sees oppression working materially in the world. Now, she, again, comes from a very kind of classic neo-Marxist background where most of what she's talking about is exploitation in the labor market. Now, one thing that's really important, I think this is a really important vibe that we really tried to, it took a long time to get there. We all come from academic backgrounds. We love to argue. We are 3 white men. Arguing and debating and all of this stuff is kind of culturally very comfortable. But we wanted to write a book that wasn't that blokey and that wasn't like, you're wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. You won't find a lot of that in the book. Some of you might be really frustrated because you're going to be looking for arguments in the text, and you might get, if the footnotes, maybe it'll get a little, more debatey in the footnotes. But a lot of, like, we really tried to build a book that was forward-looking, that was positive, that was trying to build on the work of others, not debate others, that was additive, that's a very both-and theory. So again, we're not in any way suggesting when we repurpose Iris Marion Young from kind of labor issues to more general systems issues, that exploitation in the labor market doesn't exist. We all know what's happening with essential workers all around the world. We can see who essential workers are from a race and class perspective. Like, all of the forms of exploitation that folks paying attention to labor have been paying attention to for hundreds of years are still very much present. And we don't in any way deny kind of any of those truths. We're just simply saying that there's a lot of other forms of exploitation in the housing market and the energy market and all these other places where we're exploited often as consumers. This is also really important and has been kind of undervalued. And this is, again, it's a very much of a both-and approach. And I just want to give kind of 2 quick examples about how a spatial contract perspective on exploitation can help us understand the current world, and then we'll go to questions. So again, one is, if you look at the situation when it comes to the pandemic, healthcare is a system. And so you have both classic labor market exploitation of the way, nurses and doctors and healthcare workers are often exploited, or people working in an Amazon factory, or anybody that's deemed essential. All of that continues to work. But again, in many places all around the world, right, again, it doesn't do you any good if there's no PPE, if there's not a functional healthcare system, if we don't have ventilators, you cannot fight COVID. Right? If we don't have face masks, you cannot fight COVID. A system had to produce those. And that, just taking that step back and understanding the need to make a system that actually works is at the heart of the spatial contract. And so that's, I think, one way that you can think about it. And the other way, which is obviously, very close to my heart as somebody who's a Californian and has been living in the United States, born and raised in the United States, and has worked on issues of racial justice and immigrant rights for most of his professional career, is to look at the current fight around policing. And it drives me crazy to hear folks from the right talk about this as somehow kind of anti-police, or even to portray folks who are arguing for defunding the police as somehow kind of anti-police. Nobody's arguing that that we don't need a system of public safety. The argument really right now is that the system of public safety has been so racist and so exploitative for so long that it needs to be changed, right? If you're arguing for composting toilets and opposed to sewage system, you're not anti-sewage. You're just saying, hey, listen, the system that we have may not be working in my community, and I don't want to die from poop-borne diseases, so let's fix the system. Well, guess what? People are dying from the system that is meant to protect them. That's happening in both healthcare, that's happening in policing, it's happening in the United States, and it's happening around the world. So when you're arguing for change, radical even changes in the system changes that may even involve kind of tearing down the existing system and rebuilding the system from the ground up, because sometimes, a gut rehab is what's necessary in a house, and some structures just can't be saved. They have to be torn down and rebuilt. You're not anti the system. You're just saying, hey, listen, this system isn't working. And again, that's one of the things that I think that the book really helps people able to do, is to understand that, right? Again, just because you're against, men with guns exploiting their power to be able to whatever end doesn't mean that you're against a system of public safety, right? It simply means that you're arguing that the system itself doesn't work. And what again, to see activists in the United States right now, what they're doing is sort of, in many ways, kind of everything that we're asking folks to do in the book, which is to take a deep dive into the geographic and material specificity of that system, how policing operates in Louisville, how policing operates in Minneapolis, how policing operates in San Francisco or Oakland or Los Angeles, or now, as we're seeing, in Sydney and Melbourne and Paris and London and all around the world. That's what we're asking folks to do. And again, not that anybody out in the streets is in any way responding to our book, and we're not taking a lick of credit, but it's just really important for us to kind of emphasize the ways in which I think that you can sort of see this book and use this book in this current situation. And again, as we move in California, we're now going to switch into the fire season, right? Another system, one that's much more about climate change and the climate crisis, but involves, again, both systems for the repression of fire and systems for building housing. And I think, again, we're hoping that we've written a book that is useful, that has a bit of a shelf life, that you'll be able to pick up, years from now, and it'll still have some sort of utility. We hope it's open. We hope it's accessible. We hope it's not too argumentative. It's still a pretty white book, but even though it's written by 3 men, we're hoping that you don't find it too blokey. And again, that it's a humble contribution that we hope people enjoy and get value of. And we urge you to get in contact, where you can find all of us relatively easy on the interwebs. Send us emails if we're not able to respond to questions today. But thank you all for attending. We look forward to some Q&A.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex, Matthew, and Stephen, for that fascinating talk. I think this is a great time to open up the discussion to questions from the audience. So if you haven't already done so, you can type your questions into the questions option of the event dashboard. So our first question is, Thanks for putting this talk together. My question is about global financial systems. What do the authors think about changing the global financial system within the realm of the spatial contract? How would that look like?
Do you want to have a go?
Yeah, please, Dr. Hall, after you.
Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of it's a really good question, and some of the work that's been done by another colleague in Leeds, Mark Davis, is kind of top of my mind at the moment, because my work that was on transit systems in Detroit went really deep into the kind of financial issues that they're having and where they have to draw finance and debt from. And one of the big issues, of course, is they had to go to the familiar faces, all right, the global financial system. And what Mark's been able to do in Leeds is to run a project on community municipal bonds, which has just looked at, instead of municipal bonds having to go to the bond market, which is a relatively kind of cold and uncaring place, which just evacuates any of that interest onto financial markets, why not draw on some of the savings power of local people to keep both the project and the finance and debt in the local area, so that paying off any new infrastructure projects also benefits people in that area, and that people in that area can get into financing something for a lot less money than you usually would have to do infrastructure investment. If you usually have to do infrastructure investment, you need about £25,000 minimum to be a part of a fund. And these kind of municipal bonds, that's just one instrument, by the way, would re-engineer the spatial contract around financing infrastructure in the city. And I also have a student working on something looking at how expatriated African migrants can finance local community infrastructure in Zimbabwe and other countries where, you know, some of the risk that a global financial player might not carry might be carried by people who are familiar with and still have some kind of place attachment to the area. I actually think changing the spatial contracts around financing infrastructure is one of the simpler things, because the system that we have now is so moribund and so tired and so out of touch that it's well due a refresh, and the ways that we can get our finance into digital platforms now really suggests that it's well overdue a reorganization.
I'm not an expert on global financial systems, but I think one of the features of the global financial system is its total capture by a single ideology. And I think one of the things that we push against in this book is the notion that there's a single ideological framework that can be deployed for every single intervention in the production and reproduction of reliance systems. And so what you want, I think that what, for us at least, and Stephen obviously knows more about this than I do, so I defer to Stephen to a certain degree. But I think one of the things that we would advocate would be that we're not fetishizing the local here, but there needs to be a little bit more of a kind of heterogeneous set of financial systems that fit the emerging, existing, and hoped for capacities of each community. And that so there's a kind of invitation to creativity, an invitation to experimentation that the global financial system doesn't welcome or reward. Is that fair, Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely bang on.
And I mean, it is a great question, and it actually allows me to make a point that we left out, is that, I mean, so one of the key things, and again, this is going to be, I would say, one of the most difficult things that I think for certain activists who read the book, is that we're a little bit, we're skeptical of any of all ideologies attached to systems. That also includes kind of spatial ideologies or ideologies of scale. So if you're a local is good, global is bad person, or a global is good, local is old-fashioned person, this part of the book might be a little bit of a struggle. So what's problematic about the global financial system isn't that it's global and that some sort of small relocalized system is the answer, right? The answer is to really, again, dig into what works from a scale perspective. So right now, think about so having big, large, banks privately owned in a handful of global cities exploiting their capital in different places is an exploitative system. but it's the globalness isn't necessarily inherently the problem. So look at the system of remittances that Stephen mentioned, right? So it's a fact that people live all over the world now. You're not going to undo thousands of years of migration and all these changes. And the fact that money can flow from people connected to places back into those places is a good thing. Now, right now, and it's a very important way of financing structures, and it happens all over the place. I mean, there's so many countries that are remittance dependent, you can't just get rid of it. But the companies, that the way this money flows is often in a really exploitative way. Now, sometimes some of these new tech interventions in remittances have dramatically reduced fees and exploitation in the system. So under Western Union and other certain types of companies, the amount of fees that people were charged for moving money was exploitative. Now, actually, you can get a lot cheaper. So that's actually very global and very new tech, and can be less exploitative of a system and enable that money to actually make it to where it needs to go and actually do the job of finance. To finance is to actually like invest money to build something. So again, just it's to check the instinct to automatically assume something is good or bad because of the scale at which it's operated, and really kind of dig in and see where the exploitation is happening. And yeah, it might be because of a jump in scale or a going down in scale, but it might just be actually the company, the actor itself, the institution that's being exploitative. The scale is really great, and if we just remove those exploitative relations, we'll have a more functioning system. And so that's actually gonna be one of the challenges. We build on some great work by Mark Purcell and Brandon Bourne around the local trap. That's in chapter 2, I think it is. But that's chapter 3. I don't remember. Yeah, I think chapter 3. But yeah, that's going to be one of the challenges, right? Is that this global local thing is a gnarly issue, and you need to start with the system. That would be the answer.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So we have another question, and this is directed towards Alex. Alex, is the healthcare system meant to protect us? Is the police system meant to protect us? To who does the meant refer? To an outsider, the US healthcare system is meant to enrich its investors, and the UK system is going the same way. Do you cover this in the book?
So that's an excellent question. The answer is, well, it sort of depends, right? I mean, so yeah, of course, if you look at the US system from a top-down perspective, and you look at the investor class, and you look at the sort of system of exploitation, you can argue that, yeah, absolutely, that systems of exploitation are so ingrained in both of these systems that like you can even question their purpose. You know, one thing we stay away from is the idea that these systems have any kind of inherent purpose, that the goals of any institutional actors are the purpose of the system. So to say that the US healthcare system is designed to make people sick ignores the work of like millions of nurses and doctors and health tech folks who are actually trying to heal people all the time, even in the exploitative system. And people are made better all the time, every day. And so the existence of exploitation in the system, even if its existence at the top, doesn't like undermine all of the contributions and all the things that are done. And again, same with the NHS, you know, simply because there are arseholes at the top or the direction of travel is in a shitty way, doesn't like undermine the sort of on the ground frontline work of all of these folks. And so I think that's one of again, a system-centered perspective in some way pulls us away from just seeing the kind of the evil that you might see in leadership or evil that you might see at the top. Not that that doesn't matter, but that's not the entirety of the system. Policing is obviously a very different story, right? Again, the policing system, and again, one of the reasons why the defund the police argument is being made, whereas nobody's saying, again, there might be exploitation in the NHS or the American healthcare system, but nobody's saying to burn it down. Nobody's saying that we need a page 1 rewrite or we need to start over. The policing system, on the other hand, we can argue is that, yeah, the system of public safety in African-American neighborhoods in the United States was only ever constructed in order to keep people down and never, ever, ever actually constructed to make people safe. And for that reason, you maybe need to start over. You need to look at other ways of doing it, right? Alternative medicines, let's just say, of public safety. And so again, but if you're drawing that conclusion, again, based on how it's truly kind of rooted in that particular place, in that particular way. Can the system be changed? Can the Met in London, please, can the institutionalized and systemic racism that resulted in Stephen Lawrence and the situations in London, can that be changed, or does it have to start over? right? Can the systems of exploitation in healthcare be changed? And again, I think there's a growing movement in the United States that would say that in certain policing statements that again, a more radical institutional change is necessary. In the healthcare system, again, you're not going to get rid of the hospitals, you're not going to get rid of the doctors, you're not going to get rid of the nurses, but it's going to be a different type of story. Whereas in the police department, in fact, actually, maybe the human beings that are involved are not the human beings that need to be involved in the future. But again, I would just be wary of just too big of a kind of indictment of a larger system when there are millions and millions of different actors involved.
I just want to augment one thing Alex said, which is that part of what we're hoping to do by centering this on agency and capacities is that there's a difference between critiquing how a system is presently organized and engaging in the imaginative project of constructing a novel system of building a new spatial contract. And I think that when we talk about, maybe we shouldn't talk about policing, because I don't know what capacity that realizes, but what we should talk about are the capacities that these systems are supposed to realize. So when it comes to public safety, as Alex indicated when he was talking, what we want is we want to ask ourselves, what is the capacity we want to collectively produce, right? And if we look at the current policing system in the United States, we see that it's not collectively, that system is not producing the capacities we want it to produce. And there's certain capacities that we want to produce that aren't being produced at all, not at all. And that's a form of unfreedom. So in Black and brown communities that are over-policed in some ways, are also under-policed in other ways, which is the common phrase nowadays. And that under-policing, the way to characterize that is to say that there are certain capacities that people in those communities want to have that aren't being provisioned, and they want to be able to provision them. And so that might involve, so in a way, what we want to do is get away from, it's an invitation in some ways to get away from the language of policing and move towards the language of a kind of communal imagination of what we want to be able to do and what are the systems necessary in order for us to be able to do them. I know that's very abstract, but I was just trying to augment a little bit of what Alex said. This is not a disagreement with him at all.
And actually, just as a quick final point, I think the questioner will hopefully enjoy. There's in chapter 1 we talk about some kind of key principles that we use to evaluate, to what each spatial contract, right? The sets of relations around a particular system. And one of the first questions we ask of any system is to what extent is what happening in the system? Is it about like the provision of the thing that it's meant to provide, or is it being sort of used for other purposes, right? So again, if theoretically policing is about public safety, but what it often is about the maintaining the property rights of the landed gentry. We use the example of housing a lot, right? I'm a houser. Is the housing market designed to provide shelter to people, or is it designed to provide a sort of useful financial vehicle for global capital? And the argument is that it's obviously both. And the most important, so this value, what is very important to us. Yeah, are you doing the thing that the system is sort of being publicly sold to do? Because lots of regular folks invest in that because we need that. Like, you might be trying to exploit my housing, but I'm still going to engage in the housing market because I don't got a choice, because I need housing, I need healthcare, right? And public safety is real. I mean, like, there are folks who do bad things. Like, you need some sort of ability to be protected from others in some way, I would argue. Now, how to do that is really difficult, but some of our older tribal forms of justice may also be exploitative and gendered and racist as well. So, but again, looking at, that core purpose is really important. And again, hopefully we provide a means of thinking about it in a useful way.
Okay, thank you very much. As we have another question, really interesting talk. Where exactly is the space in the spatial contract? Are you building on work in spatial justice and seeing space as integral to inequalities of access to the reliance systems you describe?
Alex.
Alex.
So the answer is that's a really good question. The space is kind of everywhere. We try in the introduction to kind of explain why we use the term. Sometimes the space is meant to really just focus on the material, like, to get people to see stuff, since most of the stuff, again, global finance aside, where the widgets are moving, through electronic means, most of the stuff is actually exists in a real geography. I mean, even the global widgets exist in real geography. I now know a lot more about server farms than I ever used to in data centers. So some of it is just, again, getting people to think about the material. A lot of it is about the relationship between core systems and settlements. Again, that kind of urban studies, human settlements perspective that sees communities, sees our systems in our communities. Again, we briefly discussed the idea of spatial justice. I'm, a hardcore Ed Sojaist. So if the questioner asks, in terms of spatial justice, but again, we don't engage too deeply because the book isn't about the idea of justice, right? So like we kind of build on Ed's work and on various other folks in spatial justice, but it's not so rooted in that. So it's kind of, again, the space is everywhere. We're always talking about housing or transport or energy or food or water, or things that are inherently spatial. So again, I hope that's a good enough answer. It's in there, but we again welcome any. I'm very curious to see any critique. One thing that we do mention again in the book is there is always a missing chapter, right? Even though there's like two of us are geographers and two of us are professional geographers, and one is I think a really highly trained amateur geographer. There isn't an analysis of the spatiality of the spatial contract, if that doesn't get too wonkish. We acknowledge that in the beginning. It would have essentially required an entirely other book. It's sort of like the sequel would be like the space of the spatial contract. So I think you'll see it. Whoever wrote the question, if you want to write the sequel, that book would be awesome. I really hope, this is my dream, is that a geographer picks this book up and it's like, this is cool, but there isn't as much geography as I want there to be, and they acknowledge it, so I'm going to write it. Yay! That's all I have to say. And please, and if you want to email me, I'd love to support that project.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. So we have another question. Thank you for the great talk and looking forward to reading the book. Can you reflect on how the ideas underpinning the spatial contract may influence our research methods to investigate the systems you describe? Do we need different or renewed methodological approaches?
Both. Both. So just in terms of, we all three of us have worked a lot on researching different areas of this thing. I think one of the real difficulties is if we're gonna just think about this in terms of scholarly research and an intellectual project, is that one method, being good at one method, won't do. It simply is not going to cut the mustard here. So if you were going to approach something like an issue of water justice, just being good on justice and different faces of justice and oppression is not going to cut it. You are going to have to do some work on the engineering elements of the things that you might talk about. Hydrology, you might need to talk about pumping systems, you might need to get some of that on you. It requires you to become a little bit like a barrister, in that you've got to become an expert in some systems real fast. And that means that for those of us who are used to more qualitative methods, that we might need to branch out into the quants, or we might need to branch out into some of the engineering elements, not necessarily to make ourselves self-conscious methodologists, but at the end of chapter 2, we make things a little easier, and we have a long list of questions in our analytical framework. And that long list of questions is simply things like, how does it work? Who owns it? How did it come to be the way it is right now? How do people utilize it? How is it financed? So you can start to build out this idea of a spatial contract by filling in some gaps. In terms of like fundamental scholarly methods, choose your own, but it's not going to be sufficient to simply adopt one methodological approach. You really want to be looking at the analytical framework as the method, and then just finding kind of individual tools to help you fulfill those questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question.
That's the first time that Matt or Alex have not responded to something I've said in 2.5 years. So it's been absolutely fabulous just for that reason alone.
Okay, we have another question. Hi, and again, thank you. I'm interested in the psychosocial dimensions around systems of reliance. Beyond agency, is there another way of thinking about the emotionally relevant aspects of a given system?
Oh, I love that question. I think this is so as Alex and Steve have indicated, there's elements of our project that, well, there's spaces where we're utterly silent. And I think that this is a space where we're totally silent. And I think that it's really important. And I think that I don't think human agency, so we characterize human agency, or I characterize it. I'll have to take responsibility for this limitation. Exclusively in this sort of almost hard-edged material terms of doing things, right? Like going places or living in a house. But of course, everything we do is emotionally valenced, and everything we do has a certain kind of meaning to it in a variety of different ways, right? There's joy, there's sadness, there's a kind of narrative wholeness to our lives, or absence, or fractures, or so on and so forth. And I think that all of these things, they don't all have to be explained using reliance systems, but I think that we have to understand reliance systems in terms of them to a certain degree. So I think that it's important for us to think a little bit about the, so I'm going to go one way and then I'll go backwards the other way. So the way I'm going here is I'm going to say, I think it's important to think about reliance systems that facilitate a certain kind of individual and, more importantly, collective emotional formation and expression. And I think that that's something we don't talk about, but I think that the capacity to like collectively feel joy or collectively grieve or any of those other, I mean, those are two big emotions, but you can think of all the other ones. I think these are things that we don't talk about, but are really important to talk about, and it's difficult and it's complicated to think through them. I don't have anything of, I think, sophisticated to say about that. And then going backwards, I think that we need to think a little bit about how joy, grief, and all these other kinds of emotions, other kinds of, like, say, narratively inflected understandings of ourselves, not to emphasize too much on narrative, going backwards, how those can actually shape the production, reproduction, and functioning of reliance systems. So I think that there's an enormous amount of work to go there, to do there, and I was recently looking at a couple things that a lecturer at Liverpool named Keir Milburn had written about joy and freedom, or an emotion and freedom, and that got me thinking about this stuff too. And so I think that there's a lot. I think there's a lot to be explored here, and so I'm sorry that that's purely gestural. I just simply want to affirm the centrality of the question that was just raised, and I think it's an incredibly interesting and exciting area to explore.
I have one reflection on that, if you wouldn't mind, Matt, with a concrete example. So we speak a lot about heat and energy, and we all know that our homes are leaky and that they're not efficient and all these things. And the way to deal with that, we would hit our climate change targets, we would save money on our energy bills, and we would have warmer, cheaper households to run if we would only retrofit them. You can make it make sense on a spreadsheet, you can make a policy to make it work, and all of those things. Some of the research coming out of the Energy Systems Catapult, and some of my colleagues will say the reason why people don't renovate their houses even when they can afford to pay is because they are afraid, because the building sector is full of cowboys and thieves, and they don't want to project manage themselves because they're frightened of it. They're frightened of having, you know, men come into their home with drills and start knackering it. So there's a huge fear factor around something that we usually think of as a consumer relation, and interfering and getting through people's doors into their homes it does terrify some people. So you won't be able to deal with the spatial contracts around heat unless you deal with that fear and emotion. We don't even touch it in the book, so there's plenty to do on that.
Okay, thank you very much. And one final question. So in complex systems, e.g. global trade, is it too much to ask to consider current governance mechanisms to consider and appreciate and take action on all the various local politics involved? Is this too ambitious and thus unachievable?
Global trade of what?
Yes.
That's what you got to ask. I got a PhD student who's blown my socks off because she's talked about the international political economy of electricity trading. So in the Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia sub-region, there's a bunch of global trade negotiations around the ASEAN area, and then the question is, how does that come to ground with electricity? Well, of course, they all say, well, we're up for free trade. And this is Claire Richardson-Barlow. I'm going to have to name her because this is her thinking, not mine. It just fits the spatial contract. When you look at that political economy, they speak the language of free trade, but they run the acts of what Claire calls neo-developmental statism, what I've understood previously as kind of Asian values capitalism. It's like, we will say the words of free trade, but when it comes down to actually screwing interconnectors into the ground, one country will not do it because it is reliant on coal and it has plenty of subsidized coal, and the other country will definitely want to do it because it has a bunch of offshore wind resource. And that material political economy, it's like the big wins of ideology in trade negotiations are important, but when you actually get to ground in trade negotiations, it's going to be what? So there's an electricity example. Think about chlorinated chicken. Think about all the other terrible things that are coming over from your unhealth conscious US citizens. But that would generally be my other authors can respond. But global trade in what would be our fundamental response?
Yeah. That's our, there's the old Rabbi Hillel joke of, stand on the 1 foot, tell me the Bible and by standing on 1 foot, and the end, so if you asked us the question, tell me the whole book on what while standing on 1 foot, it's the question, the political economy of what, right? And that's what, I mean, ideology thrives in kind of the vague spaces of talking about the economy or politics or these things in a really general way, but you can't eat electricity. Right? We talk about the idea of substitutability in chapter 2 a bunch, right? I mean, you just can't, these commodity, again, everything is, the commodity, the book is not a screed against commodification. And partly because, again, the idea of commodification reduces the specificity of the actual things themselves. Now, I understand that the financial system loves that, right? That they love to reduce the specificity and trade everything as if it's the same. So if the goal is to fight that, which is what, again, folks who are against commodification are trying to fight, well, then again, you just got to get more material. You got to understand that chickens are not even pigs, right? But they're just different animals that you feed different ways and all sorts of terrifying processing ways. That's a vegetarian, so it's probably horrifying them. But yeah, that get down to the material of what you're actually trading.
We're really into use values, if you want to get on Marxist on it.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I think this is a good moment to wrap up this MUP Armchair event and to thank everyone for attending, and also to thank you, Alex, Matthew, and Stephen for giving up your time to participate.